Does our city manager have any comments or update on city operations under item G?
I do, Mayor. I have asked Rick to load a couple of graphics. When we held our city council retreat a couple of meetings ago, the city council set as its very first priority for 2015 to deal with residential roads. And I wanted to talk for a minute about the environment in which that discussion will take place, and talk a little bit about the street program and the work that's been done on the street program in general up to this point. The graphic you see in front of you represents the issue of streets. We have 1,234 miles of streets in the city of Corpus Christi. With the streets, we are facing a fairly significant deferred maintenance issue, and the council and independent appointed committees have studied this for a number of years. They have looked in detail at the issue of bringing our streets up to an acceptable standard. As the council received those recommendations from the committees and staff, we really kind of divided the issue of streets into four parts. The first part being policy type issues, the second part dealing with maintenance, a third part dealing with necessary reconstruction of arterial and collector roads, and then the fourth part being the necessary reconstruction of residential and local streets. As the council has approached this problem over the past couple of years, and most specifically in 2013-14, spent a lot of time and a lot of energy going through our 3D process: discovery, discussion, and then decision making. We really kind of took the issue of how do we bring our streets up to an acceptable standard. We divided that into four parts, and then we took them on one at a time. Let's go to the next slide. The first one we dealt with was the policy issues, and the two key areas in the policy issues dealt with the street cut policy and also the design life of the streets. And what we found as we studied that was that a street that has been cut for utilities or some other purpose actually degrades much faster than if it hadn't been cut. And so we changed our policy about when a street can be cut and how it needed to be repaired in order to maintain the integrity of that street and prolong its lifespan. We also took on the design life. Prior to the council acting on this issue, we generally had a 20-year requirement for a design life on streets that we built as a city. Streets that were being constructed by other parties and then contributed to the city had no real specific design life criteria, and it was possible, and we actually experienced situations where people would build a street with approximately as little as a 5-year life on it, dedicate it to the city, and by the time it was dedicated to us, we had inherited a maintenance responsibility that was pretty substantial. So as the council went through that policy, you set a 30-year standard for the design of all roads, whether it's done by the city or anyone else, and then contributed. Any road that the city is going to accept maintenance on as of approximately a year ago, and when this was changed, will require a 30-year design life. Let's go to the next slide. Then we dealt with the maintenance, and on the maintenance, as you look at this graphic, you can see that in 2010, we estimated that there was about $106 million worth of work that needed to be done. Now, I can tell you 4 years later, 5 years later, if we were to do that estimate, it would be much higher. That's the same issue that we're dealing with the 2012 bond project costs. The costs have escalated pretty severely, in this last 4 or 5 years. The PCI represents Pavement Condition Index, and this maintenance quadrant really deals with streets that have a PCI index above 55. In other words, they're salvageable. By good maintenance, you can maintain and prolong the life of those streets. And you can see the left there a list of funding sources that we have assembled over the last couple of years, including a street fee for $11.4 million. Toward the bottom of that list, you can see that we transferred money that was located in other general fund departments all into a dedicated street fund that's completely set apart for accountability and to make sure that any money we put in there is used only for the streets. And we're now operating on about a $33 million budget for maintenance, which we think is acceptable. We think that we can maintain our streets on that level of funding. Let's go to the next slide. Then we deal with the arterial and collector streets. And the way we've addressed this issue is by issuing bonds for the reconstruction of arterials and collectors, which have a pavement condition index lower than 55. And I think we're on I can't remember now whether it's our second or third bond issuance. I think it's our third one, if I remember correctly, in dealing with arterial and collector streets. And our intent there was to issue $55 million worth of work every 2 or perhaps every 4 years. It's now appearing that 4 years might be more reasonable than 2 years. But the point is that on a regular basis, we're going to issue debt in order to rebuild the key arterial and collector roads. And the intent there, as the council discussed it, was that those roads that get the highest use and the most common use by all of our residents are the ones that we would focus on first. Further, we select them based on their pavement condition index, in other words, the worst first, so that we look at roads that need to be reconstructed the most as our first consideration. That point is modified only by the constructability issue. In other words, if you got 4 or 5 roads all in one spot that need to be reconstructed, we'll spread them out so as to keep the traffic availability moving in a particular area. But if those roads are far enough apart that you can do worst first, that's the way we do it. Let's go to the fourth quadrant. And this is the area that the council has indicated you want to take on during the next year and really look at and figure out how to resolve the improvement, the reconstruction of our local streets. Let me remind you that the maintenance quadrant does affect local streets because we maintain all of our streets with that maintenance fund, both arterials, collectors, and the local and residential streets. But if a residential street has a pavement condition index below 55, it needs to be reconstructed. And unlike the other 3 quadrants, we have not identified a sufficient funding source yet. You will see from the little grid down there that we put together, we have identified several $1 million a year to be used for residential and local streets. The council adopted policies last year that put those funding sources in place, and we've built them into our budget projections. But those amounts of money are not sufficient to handle the full scope of work. And you can see there in 2010, we estimated that the value or the cost of the work that needed to be done would be about $492 million. In 2014, that same block of work has increased in estimation up to about $881 million. So that will be the focus of the discussion. We'll go through a discovery phase. We'll get into some detail about what roads need to be reconstructed, where they're located, what they look like, and whatever other facts we need to assemble, we'll go through that process. We'll make proposals on potential funding alternatives, and then the council will assimilate all that information and start a pretty serious discussion about where we're going to be taking that. Again, that's council's number one priority for 2015. I think there's a final slide that kind of summarizes, no, it's got two more slides. I wanted to make these two additional points before you see the final one. Both of the quadrants of this program, the arterial streets and the local street reconstruction, both of those also have pretty significant impacts on our underground utilities. In other words, you've got a road that's deteriorating, is in bad shape, and it needs to be rebuilt. But in most cases, underneath that road, there are water, sewer, and storm, sometimes gas lines that also need to have attention. And for every dollar that we spend on the roads, we spend just a little bit less than that for the underground utilities. And we always have to keep that in mind. Typically, up to this point, the cost of those underground utilities has not been paid by bonding. It's been paid not by general obligation bonding. It has been paid through debt issued in the utility funds, in the water and sewer and stormwater funds. So we always have to keep in mind that there's an additional impact because of the road program on our utilities. On the left-hand quadrant, what you have there is this plan has been built on an assumed life cycle program. If you look at that, if you start with new construction, this assumes that 7 years after new construction you do a seal coat, 7 years after that you do an overlay, 7 years after that you do another seal coat, and by the time you get to the 28th or 30th year in that range, you're ready for another reconstruction issue. And so all of the cost estimates that we've talked about up to this point have the assumption of that particular life cycle. Let's go to the summary page. There's everything we previously showed you on one page, and that kind of sets the background, I think, for future discussion of the council's number one priority for 2015.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. Mr. Scott?
Yeah, Ron, I'm always leery to ask questions about something I think I'm supposed to know about. You probably talked about this before, but on the local and residential streets section, you say it's $492 million in 2010, and then $881 million 4 years later. That's a 80%, 100% increase, 90%.
It's large, yeah.
So two things. One, I don't recall that there being a 100% increase in 4 years. So I want somebody you can follow up later. And then two, going up to Arterial and Collector Streets, you have that number at $369 million in 2010, but you don't list a 2014 number.
Yeah, and that's because we have been working in getting prepared for the discussion with the City Council on residential streets. We've been trying to update the cost estimates on that. We have not gone back and done that with the arterial quadrant. And to answer your question, when we get into the discovery phase, those are questions that we anticipate and will be prepared to answer for you about those cost estimates and how they've changed. That really comes back to the scope of the work is the same. It really comes back to the increase in costs that we've seen in terms of materials and labor and construction costs generally.
So, okay, and the street number is just the street. It's not the infrastructure below the street,
That's
881.
correct. That's correct.
So then I'm gonna finish with what I've been a team player and talked about Eagleford and all the new construction, but I am becoming increasingly concerned that we just frankly had bad numbers in 2010 and would kind of like to know how that happened. And I guess that's going to be part of your presentation. I just wanted to relay that I'm really unhappy about that. You know, I was here when they were presented. I stood up in front of everybody and told them those are the numbers. And then in the interviews in the last couple of weeks, I blamed it on Eagleford. But I've since become convinced that's not necessarily the case, that we just did a really poor job, and I'd like to talk about it when we talk about the street stuff. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Scott. On the residential street portion, the bottom right-hand yellow quadrant, is there somewhere in here that, if I remember when we had the residential reconstruction presentation, it was over 800 million, and I can't speak to the gap, though, that your concern of the 492 million, which is certainly valid. But did I recall that it was over 70% of our residential streets that are in need of reconstruction?
I don't recall the exact number, Mayor, but it's a high percentage of the roads that need attention are residential and local roads.
Yeah, I think that's what I recalled when we had that presentation, that it was over 70% of our residential streets that need reconstruction. And so we're going to have to get some, reality checks. We certainly want to be, aggressive in addressing the solution and the fixing, but I also don't want to set us up for failure in what we represent within a time frame of what we can do once we get to this resolution, of how soon we're going to be able to get them reconstructed because of the limited, let's just say the limited materials also that we have available to be doing all the very huge, ambitious investments that we're doing, and that we will continue to be ambitious. But I just want us to, on the front end, to be, our projections to be on the side of caution and conservatism because of working with our public and their expectations of when things will be done.
I can tell from the questions you're already asking that our discovery phase, when we launch into this, is going to get really interesting.
Well, and I think it needs to be candid and constructive as we move forward, and certainly because this is a huge priority that all of us believe in. Mr. McGill?
Great, thank you, Mayor. I think it was April 2014 when we had our last presentation on a local street reconstruction program, or the one I remember, and it listed off different funding sources, and I think that's how we got to where we are in terms of just stepping forward to funding residential streets, and obviously it's a larger problem than what we're funding today. From what I recall, it was about 70 to 80% of all streets, and I remember the numbers of a residential street being about $1 million a mile, and I think that's what Mr. Biles had said last year. And so when we're talking about 70 to 80% of 1,234 miles, the 881 million kind of just hits right on par with that. So I'm less concerned about the numbers that we've had in the past. I'd rather tackle the problem we have today. And looking at our residential streets, I see that you have there vote to repurpose baseball stadium, and that's something we had discussed previously, and just kind of looking at different funding sources. And I would encourage the conversation even in terms of creation of a type B type of corporation, which allows for infrastructure investment in Texas. We are the largest city in Texas that has a type A corporation, and so we should explore those opportunities. We should also look at our funding partners with the RTA that have grant capabilities and matching funds to be able to improve sidewalks within a quarter mile of each bus stop, which includes residential streets as well. So there's a large portion of funding in residential streets that you could partner with the RTA as well. So as we go through this discussion, I'm less concerned about the big number because you approach it at one step at a time. So my intent is I agree on managing expectations with the public. Is it may take a year to come up with the implementation plan. It may take that long for the discovery process to happen. And so doing it right the first time when we approach this, I think, is important. And so I'm looking for identifying the plan this year, identifying funding, hopefully maybe next year, and just looking at lining up the ability to be able to fund it properly and consider different models. And I know there are some out there that work better than others, but I've repeatedly said the one in St. Paul, Minnesota, what they do is they implement over a 20-year period. They say we're going to fund annually the same exact predictable amount, and then the second part of that is how that goes through that matrix of which streets and neighborhoods go through that process. So I'm looking forward to the conversation and willing to help tackle the big problem. So thank you.
I will quickly add that I did not mean to imply by that last thing about, that you brought up, Mr. McGill, about the vote to repurpose the baseball stadium. I did not mean to imply that that decision has been made.
Correct.
On that, because it has
Correct.
not. It hasn't even really been talked about publicly or openly or debated appropriately with the council. I just listed it there as a possible option.
Right. I think it was brought up last year, just briefly in comments. So I think that's just one of the items that we'll have to consider. So, thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. McGill. Also, we had, you had given me some clarity regarding our industrial district revenues that we have and what we appropriated once they come into play in 2016 in the future. That's referred here. And I would like to take just one more look at that, if we can, as a possible additional funding source, because I know we're going to need many. And we may end up at the same place, Mr. Olson, but I just think in good conscience it's still something that stays with me. So if you can just hang in there with me while we all struggle through this, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, hang there in there with all of us. All right, we're going to move forward to the, is there anything else, Mr. Olson?
No, that's all I had today. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, thank you very much.